The main thrust of what I want to talk about over the next 45 minutes is actually to explore and explain the continued importance of witchcraft accusations in Europe and in America after the witch trials. But to kind of make sense of that, I just want to go back to looking at the witch trials themselves. And I think both Jessica and Deborah have already touched upon this in relationship to vampires and werewolves. So let's begin. What was a witch? What was a witch 500 years ago? This is when the witch trials crank up in Europe. Sometimes the witch trials often think to be a medieval or something of the Middle Ages. This is a complete misnomer. It's a misnomer that was being peddled in the 19th century. The witch trials in this country and across Europe begin in the late 15th century and are at their peak around 1600. So when we go back to 1450, 1500, who were these people that the authorities and the general population were scared of? Why was it thought fit to introduce laws to exterminate them? Well, in short, a witch is someone who practices harmful magic. Magic itself is diverse. There's a whole range of magical practitioners 500 years ago, just as there were a century ago in Europe, and even today. There were those who were considered to do good things, particularly those who countered witches, who countered harmful magic, and those who only used their magic for harm and evil. And these were the people that they were called witches. And the term witch itself is an Anglo-Saxon term with some obscure origins. We're not quite sure exactly what its original meaning was, but probably the best sort of understanding of it in Anglo-Saxon terms would be someone, again, who has some sort of divinatory power. So how did we get from a point at which this sort of term where witches wasn't necessarily negative to a point 500 years later where a witch is explicitly negative, explicitly harmful? Why would there be people in your community who wanted to do harm to you? And this all comes back to what is the core of witchcraft, whether it's 500 years ago or today, and that is witchcraft is an explanation for misfortune. I kind of think we live in a world where we don't actually, I sometimes hear people say, gosh, we constantly question things. When in fact, I don't think we question things as near as much as people used to 500 years ago when you were living absolutely in utter poverty, where one piece of misfortune that your pig dies or your leg goes lame can be the ruination of you because you cannot work or you cannot feed yourself. Living in that sort of chaotic world where you don't understand the forces around you, where misfortune is a daily threat to your existence, then you seek constantly to try and understand why things happen, why things go wrong. Because if you can find out who, rather than what has caused that misfortune, then you can do something about it, you can reverse it. Whereas today we rather accept misfortune. We don't seek to find someone to blame for why our car breaks down at a certain point. But if your cart broke down, the wheel broke down 500 years ago, why was it then? Why was it at that moment? Why wasn't it half an hour later? Why wasn't it yesterday? Why was it me? Why was it not my neighbor? So you're always trying to find a cause for your misfortune. And this is at the core of most witchcraft accusations, finding the reason for misfortune. Once you've identified the misfortune, you identify the person who caused it, you can do something, you can reverse misfortune. So that fundamentally is the basis of witchcraft accusations. But that's only one aspect of it. That's not the reason why the authorities start promulgating laws in the early 16th century against witches. They're not concerned. The elite, the authorities aren't concerned with that everyday common level of concern about misfortune, the explanation for it, and doing something about it. The elite, and increasingly in the early 16th century, are concerned about Satan, about the devil. We're living in a time of the literal reading of the Bible, literal reading of the New Testament. And those of you who have read Revelations at the end of the New Testament, an extraordinary document, if you read that literally, then the world is going to come to an end. The Antichrist will come down, he will annihilate everyone apart from the few elect, and then Christ will come back, and there will be a 1,000-year reign of Christ in a new Jerusalem. So this was a fundamental reality for people, particularly literary people, those who could read the Bible in the early 16th century. So there's increasing concerns that the apocalypse is nigh. And one of the signs of the apocalypse is nigh is that the devil will increase his works in the land. So this is at elite thinking level. This is the learned, the theologians, the authorities. And so the trials start primarily in Central Europe around the 1450s. These are the very first ones. These are Inquisition trials. These are not permanent inquisitions like the Spanish one. They're periodic ones that the Catholic Church set up. And increasingly seem to be thinking they're finding more and more heretical sects in Central Europe. And of course, torture is applied. People confess to doing all sorts of things. They confess in particular to meeting with the devil, to supplicating the devil. These accounts get published, and we've got the rise of the Gutenberg press, so we have the rise of printing happening at the same time. So the stories gained from torture are printed, and they spread. The fear spreads. So we start getting, because of print and because of torture and the role of these, the authorities, a growing concern and fear that the devil is increasing his works across the land, and therefore this is all heralding the apocalypse. This is further heightened, of course, with the rise of Protestantism. For the Catholic Church, what is the break with Rome, Luther, and Protestantism? This is another sign of the devil, Satan, increasing his works in the land. It is a satanic assault upon Christendom. But of course, from the other side, the Protestants are accusing the Pope of being the devil's sidekick. It is the corruption, horrible corruption of the church, they say, which is clearly a sign that the devil is in charge of the papacy. So the Reformation itself further stokes up these broader intellectual theological concerns. There's also royals. We've got centralization of power going on across Europe. Henry VIII, the classic example, who, once you centralize power, you start having concerns about the role, in particular, you see this across Europe, kind of these centralized states, the role of prophecy. And so there are clearly concerns that prophecy can undermine legitimate rulers as well. So we start getting laws against prophecy. So all this is ratcheting up. And it's particularly following the Carolina Code, which was introduced across the Holy Roman Empire in the 1530s, which kind of was the key law in Europe, which said we must exterminate witches. This is what witches are. We must do something about them. The law also said we must exterminate all those who practice magic. So in other words, from an elite point of view, witchcraft and magic are all harmful. Right? There's no distinction there. In fact, some of the theologians actually say that those who practice supposedly good magic are worse than those who will practice harmful magic, i.e. witches. Because witches may kill you, but those who practice or say they practice good magic are luring the customers into committing sin by turning them away from God. They're damning their souls. If a witch kills someone, the witch isn't damning their soul. That soul can still go to heaven. If someone practicing good magic lures someone into a client and basically says, I can help you cure witches, I can do something about it, you're not trusting your faith in God to do it. And therefore, you're turning them away, you're damning their souls. So from an elite point of view, witchcraft, magic, in all its variations, was to be punished and suppressed. So there we are. We're in a situation now with the laws, and in this country, the first law comes in under Henry VIII, 1542, and it's not particularly used much. We don't know of any case of prosecutions under that law, but they're cranking up. These trials are cranking up in Europe, and again, more and more publications are starting to coming out by judges, by theologians, and obviously by rulers themselves who are saying, look, we've got the evidence, this is happening. We just discovered a nest of 20 of them, 30 of them, 50 of them. 100 of them. It's growing. This problem is growing. And so when Elizabeth comes to the throne and introduces a new Witchcraft Act in 1563, this is when in this country we start following suit and catching up, in a sense, in the witch extermination business in the rest of Europe. So there's two things going on here. There's the ground level concern with the everyday and misfortune, and there is the elite level of a satanic conspiracy that needs to be suppressed. And the laws are introduced because of the elite concerns, but the common people can now take advantage. For the first time, they can use the legal authority to try and deal with the witches in their midst. So that's kind of the background. But how do you know who's a witch? How do you know who's a witch? Well, there is obviously the stereotypical view of the witch that we still see today in Halloween costumes, And this is a woodcut from one of these witch trial pamphlets explaining these iniquitous witches and all the terrible things they did and how good it was that they were punished. And here's an example of one of those from around the 1560s. This is obviously presenting the elite view. Here are three witches supplicating the devil. And they've got little mannequins, little puppets there, which they're going to do harm by sticking pins into it with their client. And of course, it's the devil who's given them these powers. But just look at the thing. One, they're women. And roughly 80% of those prosecuted and exterminated across Europe for witchcraft were women. And we're looking around 30 to 50,000 people in the totality. 30, 50,000 people who were killed, executed in various hideous ways from around 1450 to 1780. But these woodcuts also helped foster that there was an archetype of a witch. Right? Because remember, vast majority of people are illiterate. Obviously, people who are literate did read out trial pamphlets in pubs and things like that. But it's the imagery that can have a profound influence on how people conceptualize who might be a witch. And obviously, they all emphasize that they're women. So that's one thing. But two, there's the physical. There's the big chin. You can notice there. And the pointy nose, slightly hunched, elderly. These are the classic stereotypes of the witch, and we'll see these coming through again when I'm talking about some of the witchcraft accusations and assaults that take place in the 20th century. There is a stereotype. The marginal woman, normally past childbearing age, because why would a woman want to, say, for example, bewitch the child of another woman? It's because they're envious, they're spiteful. Why would they be envious and spiteful? Because they can't have children anymore. So there's a logic to why people would assume that witches might be elderly women or women past childbearing age at least, because they're the ones who are going to be envious because they can no longer have children. The stereotype often portrays them as single or solitary women, widows in many cases, and quite a lot of widows in that sort of position were actually prosecuted for the various things they were accused of doing. But why would they be? Why widows are marginal? Because they're alone. Again, they might be bitter, got no husband. These would all be explanations for why they might be envious and want to do nasty things to their neighbours. Also because a lot of elderly women in that position went begging. And they would go door to door. And if they were refused and then something happened on the farm, why did that happen? My cow just fell ill. Who was the last person that came knocking at my door? It was the old widow woman down the lane. Put two and two together. So all these sort of circumstances and explanations and physical appearance and social status all kind of helped in forming a reputation for witchcraft. But I have to say, underlining that is that many accusations and many prosecutions were not against elderly women who look like that. There is a stereotype, it does work and people are accused, but many accusations are about much more different things. They're to do with family feuds, internal conflicts. It doesn't necessarily come down to age at all, doesn't necessarily come down to gender. So it's much more complex than just thinking of the stereotype or archetype, but it's a key part. And of course, when we're looking at the witch trials and the accusations and the evidence that comes forward for the existence of witches and what they do, there's a clear distinction between England and its laws and Europe, vast areas of Europe, and its laws. In England, not in the UK, in England we had common law, which means that someone has to bring a case to prosecute it. On the continent, they have inquisitorial Roman law at this time, which means a judge can investigate, question people. If a rumor is heard that there is a witch in a community doing harmful things, a judge can come and investigate. The judge, or a group of judges, can also apply torture. Torture was illegal in this country for witchcraft. The only use of torture in what is now the UK was in Scotland, where mild forms of torture was allowed. And of course, Scotland had quadruple the number of executions than we did in England. So torture is a key part of this story on the continent. The vast majority of those executions are in Europe, in Central Europe, in those areas where inquisitorial law held reign. And of course, if you start applying torture to people, they will confess to anything. and the various means and modes of torture. I mean, I think the human race is never so more ingenious than when it comes to finding ways of torturing other people. And here's a depiction, simple depiction here of a standard one where you hold the nose and you pour water down into the lungs. So it's basically flood tied down. But there are many, many ways. And strapado, where, for example, your hands are tied behind your back and you're slowly lifted up so they get pulled out of their sockets. And all the time these things are happening, you're being asked leading questions. Did you meet the devil? Where did you meet the devil? Who else was at that Sabbath? Did you kiss the devil's behind? There's a standard set of questions which gets asked as the rack winds. And so it becomes self-confirming. People go, yes, that did happen to me under torture. Very few people could withstand torture and say they were innocent. And people get named, and it spirals. One person names 10 people get brought in, they get tortured, they name 100 people. Before you know it, you have a situation as in Ellwangen, in the town of Ellwangen in Germany, where 450 people end up being executed in a very short space of time because they will start accusing each other. And it only collapses when the wife of one of the judges, investigating judges, gets accused under torture. And then something happens, then it stops. So the torture also brings out these stereotypes again of what the witch does in satanic ways, which then, as I say, gets printed and spread and spread and spread. So how does this all collapse? How do these witch trials end? Why do they end? Well, the decline is far from simple. The reasons why the laws are repealed slowly but surely into the 17th century, into the 18th century. I mean, the standard one is because we have the Enlightenment in the 18th century, that science dispels the reality of witchcraft. This really isn't the case at all. There are a number of reasons why the witch trials end, and you can't pinpoint it because people are getting more educated, or necessarily more skeptical even. The reasons why they end are more about process. One, legal issues. The laws and questioning and the nature of evidence, the lawyers become much more acute and aware and discerning about the problems of the evidence they're hearing in court. This comes down to the idea of spectral evidence, the idea that someone says, I saw the witch and she was pinching and punching me and she made me fly over the house. Well, did anyone else see this? Now that might be perfectly accepted as proof. Someone said it, I saw the witch, she did that to me. That might be accepted as proof in 1600. Come 1680, the legal sort of acumen in the courts was suddenly say, hold on, actually, that's taking, if no one else saw it, how can we take this as proof and evidence? It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but we can't accept it as evidence. So although there is skepticism, that isn't skepticism, that's about discernment, legal discernment. So that's one key thing of why, slowly but surely, the witch trials wind down. Another one is sort of from the ground up, is that it's expensive to go to law. You have to pay to get your witnesses to go to court, you have to house them, etc., etc. It doesn't sound like, well, there are many other ways that a common person can deal with witches. You don't have to go to the law. So there's a degree to which the witch trials, financially and for all the effort, may not be the best way after all, particularly when you see them getting out of it. Because the majority of people who are prosecuted for witchcraft in this country are found not guilty. You've just gone to all that expense. So there are pragmatic reasons why the witch trials may come to an end as well. So the laws against witchcraft are slowly but surely repealed, as I said. In this country, that's in 1736. The last person in this country who was found guilty and sentenced to death was in 1712, the famous Jane Wenham affair in Hertfordshire, who was found guilty, not of all the huge number of petty cases of witchcraft that the neighbours came forward with, but because she was accused and found guilty of talking to the devil in the form of a cat. So it's that satanic evidence which outrules the evidence of people bewitching their pigs and their chickens and making me lame and making me fly over a tree, and all that stuff gets dismissed. That's crap evidence now. But the satanic one, that still has currency. And this is because, in part, early 18th century, rise of the Enlightenment, rise of deism, rise of theism. This was a crisis moment for the Church of England in this country, and a crisis moment for some of the churches across Europe. Because if you deny the existence of witches, it undermines and unravels the whole system of supernatural belief underpinning the Bible. And so you get these big debates taking place saying, well, if you deny witchcraft, you're essentially denying miracles themselves. And if you deny miracles, you're questioning the Bible. And so rather than there being, some linear growth of skepticism in the early 18th century about witchcraft and witches, it's a much more confused state. And what you rarely get, even into 1750s, what you don't get is someone saying witches do not exist from an intellectual point of view. The intellectual argument, the thrust of the intellectual argument is very much witches no longer exist. And that's a key fundamental. The two get often confused by historians, as though somehow witchcraft is no longer considered to be a reality in intellectual circles in the 18th century. Because the Bible is still believed to be the ultimate authority. William Blackstone, one of the greatest legal authorities in this country of the 18th century, said, I do not deny the existence of witchcraft because witchcraft is said in the Bible. The Bible states there are witches. What I believe is that they no longer exist. I don't know why they no longer exist, but they no longer exist. It is not a problem. We don't need laws for it because they no longer exist. They're part of the past. But they do exist or have existed. So that isn't skepticism, again. That's not the rise of skepticism or rationalism. And also, from an intellectual point of view in the 18th century, how can you dismiss the weight of evidence of all those 30,000 to 50,000 people who were murdered the century and a half previous? Do you say they were all wrong? To do that would to be undermine the whole intellectual world of their ancestors, of their fathers and their grandfathers, the greatest minds of the 16th and 17th century. You would undermine their case. So to say that witches didn't exist would pull the rug from under 2 centuries of intellectual endeavor as well. So there's a lot at stake. There's a lot at stake when you say, I don't believe in witches in the 18th century. Now, the last execution for witchcraft in Europe was in the 1780s in Switzerland. But like quite a lot of the 18th century trials, it wasn't a trial under witchcraft laws. Essentially, it was a trial about witchcraft, but prosecuted for poisoning. Anna Gouldy, a woman who was eventually executed in Switzerland, was accused of a whole series of witchcraft crimes, but is actually prosecuted for poisoning. In the 1740s, we get a whole series of magic trials in parts of Germany and in France. And in 1740s, for example, around Lyon, 2 defrocked priests are burned alive for practicing magic. So even though the witches per se are not being prosecuted, or very few of them, come the mid-18th century, there are still kind of trials where you might call it witchcraft without witches taking place. But for the mass of the people in the 18th century, mid-18th century onwards, who still believe in witches, and the mass of the people still do believe in witches, people are still carrying on making the same levels of witchcraft accusations in 1750 as they were in 1650 or 1450 or 1550. It's just that once the laws are taken away, what do? Well, you go back to those whole host of other ways in which you deal with witches in your neighborhood. And one of those is to swim them. And this is a depiction of a famous case in the 1750s in Tring. In Hertfordshire has a very bad reputation for its actions against witches well into the age of the so-called Enlightenment. And this took place in Tring in the 1750s. That is, the poor woman Ruth Usborne and her husband were ducked for being witches. They were swum. This was a test of their guilt. The old test was that the waters represented God's baptismal waters. If you were thrown in and you floated, God had rejected you. If you sank, God had received you, but you also probably drowned at the same time. It's the classic sort of great trial. But this was enacted numerous times in England into the mid-19th century. And in other parts of Europe where swimming was also practiced, we find examples, again, into the 19th century. There was another big murder trial in northeastern Germany in 1824, 1825, because of mass swimming where the woman died, and that led to prosecutions. In this case, Thomas Colley, who is the man pushing poor Ruth Usborne under. Ruth Usborne dies choking on the mud, and Thomas Colley is eventually executed and hanged for his role in that affair. But that affair attracted some 10,000 people to come and see it. Town criers from the neighboring towns announced it. It was a huge public event. People wanted to come and see the punishment. Because essentially what happens is this swimming is not so much about a trial anymore, it's a punishment. Let's go and see the witch be swum. And so take the laws away and the people are still taking the law into their own hands at this point. And the authorities' response to this is normally one of embarrassment. They don't want to talk about witches. On a number of occasions, we get examples where a witch swimming is about to take place, and they've grabbed the witch and they're taking it to the pool or the stream. And some gentleman, as the reports say, advised them to go home. So there's no prosecutions. Let's just try not. We don't want to be talking about witchcraft in the courts anymore. Embarrassment, again, for the reasons I've just talked about people actually not explicitly saying there are no witches anymore. It's an embarrassing topic for the intellectual elite at this time. So move into the 19th century, and across Europe, there are hundreds of trials, what we might call reverse witch trials. Trials where it's no longer the witch who is the defendant, but the people harming suspected witches who are the defendants. It's the suspected witch who is now leading the prosecution and not being prosecuted. So in other words, the courts are allowing a new venue here, and they always had done, in fact. Suspected witches could still take people to court for slander in the 17th century, etc. But in the 19th century, people are still going out and abusing witches, scratching them, murdering them across Europe. Just to give you a few examples, in the 1880s, in a part of Germany, a prosecution took place because a woman believed she was bewitched. She had spent 3 years in bed lame. They found the identity of who they thought was responsible, which was responsible, and they drew her blood and gave the blood to the woman, and she supposedly was healed. Now, the police didn't intervene in this case, and those who went and abused the witch and drew her blood were prosecuted. A similar case happened a few years later in Poland. So that extraction of blood, for example, to cure witchcraft led to some of these assault cases and trials. In the UK, I did a systematic survey of court trial records in 19th century Somerset and came across 26 court cases where suspected witches had prosecuted those who had scratched them to draw blood, or who had abused them, forced them out of their village. One poor old woman, 90 years old, was beaten repeatedly on her back by a farmer to draw blood, for example. Another case of a woman who was dragged to a barn and surrounded by dozens of people. She was whipped with bramble and briar on her back and scratched to draw blood across her back. So all these trials are being prosecuted at least. So what we're having is essentially a continuation of witch trials, but just a reversal of who's doing the prosecuting. Those stories of witchcraft are still coming out. This is still valuable information for an historian. It reveals the ways in which our notions of progress or societal conformity are nonsense, because the vast majority of people are still believing in witchcraft and trying to do something about it. And this is, I found, even more interesting when you then look at the United States, because in the 19th century, what's happening in America is you've got vast waves of Europeans emigrating to the States, and they bring with them their own beliefs from their different countries, whether it's Lithuania, whether it's Serbia, whether it's Spain, whether it's France, or the UK, Scotland, Ireland, forming their new communities in a bewildering new land, forming new communities where there are bound to be disputes, misfortunes, living on the edge. And not surprised then that what we find is a huge number of, again, witchcraft accusations and witchcraft assaults taking place across 19th century America, and trials that also ensue. And I'll just give you an example here. This is actually from 1911. And this is the woman being depicted being stoned by local boys. This is in a small town just east of New York. And poor old Meta Immerman, who's being depicted there, had gone there for a cure, for a hydrotherapy cure. But because, as part of this hydrotherapy cure, she had to walk at dawn on the dew in bare feet. And the fact that she was pursuing a vegetarian diet was very mysterious, very puzzling for some of the neighbors. And so when she mysteriously went out at dawn walking bare feet, she must have been up to some harmful magic ritual. And of course, one or two of the boarders in the house where she was staying fell ill. Boom. How do you explain it? Well, there's that weird woman who keeps going out walking in the dew and only eats nuts. And so this escalated, accusations started being made, and poor Meta Immerman basically was hounded out of town, escorted by the police, as depicted there, as the community stoned her. This is in 1911 in America. And there are numerous other cases like that I could report. In the Somerset cases I was just talking to, when we're talking about the experience of witchcraft and why people might believe or continue to believe, the Somerset cases reveal a very interesting aspect of witchcraft belief, which is what's known in the West Country as hag riding, or being hag-ridden. Because 5 of those assault cases from people who had nocturnal experiences that we can identify as sleep paralysis. And some of you might have experienced this condition. It's when you wake up at night and you're paralyzed, but your motor neuron system is going mad. You can see, you can hear, but you're paralyzed. It's a very scary. I've only had it once in my life. And it is accompanied by hallucinations, oral hallucinations and visual hallucinations. And it's to do with REM sleep, the disturbance of REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And if you're living in a world where who might be assaulting you at night in your bed, forcing you, and you have a great feeling or weight of pressure on the chest, like that, it feels suffocating. I once had it when a disembodied grey hand came over the bed, and I was paralyzed, and it started throttling me, which isn't very nice, and you can't do anything about it, and you woke up very scared. And you see this in numerous witch trials from the early modern period onwards. It was known in ancient Greece as the Ephialtes, the throttler. So it's a human experience, it's a physical experience. Yet here in the 19th century, it's still leading to witchcraft accusations because people blame it on that. I said, I saw the witch, she was sitting on me. Right? I'm got to do something about it. The next day, what do? You go around and you draw blood from the witch. She then launches a suit, and we find all about it in the petty sessions and the quarter session courts of Somerset, well into the 19th century. So there are physical reasons and physical explanations for some of these. And say 5 of those trials resulted from sleep paralysis. Back to America, and with all these Europeans flooding in, all with their different diverse beliefs from across Europe, what you do find is that new witchcraft traditions develop. New explanations for witchcraft and how witches do things through contact between Europeans, Native Americans, and African Americans. New traditions emerge. And I'm just showing this one, which is a bezoar. This is actually what's called a gastric concretion that you get in cows. Humans also get it when you chew or eat hair. The hair is very indigestible, and so it accumulates in the gut and forms these very hard balls, and you can just see the hair. This is a cow bezoar. And they get it quite frequently, and horses do, because they lick their young and they swallow the hairs, and the hair doesn't get digested but forms this gastric concretion. I did some research to find that in the 19th century, 26 people died, women died of gastric concretions because they chewed on their hair. They had ponytails, they chewed on their hair, and they developed these gastric concretions, and some of them died from it. Anyway, that's besides the point. But gastric concretions. Back to gastric concretions. Now, across Europe, and I've spent many years studying 19th century witchcraft beliefs across Europe, and I don't find any examples of these being associated with witchcraft. You go to the States in the 19th century, and it becomes one of the main forms of proof that your cattle have been bewitched. And people will take their cattle, their horses, they'll be cut open. You find one of those, that's absolute cast iron proof that you've been bewitched, that your cow died from that. And so, how does that tradition come about? Why is it that German Americans, British Americans, Irish Americans are believing in this in America and not believing in it there? And the only thing I can think of is the traditions from Native Americans, who had long had this idea that witches sent bones and feathers and these concretions into the bodies of their victims. And then the medicine men would perform their rituals and supposedly cut it out. Now, most of the time it's fraudulent activity again, all sorts of sleight of hand. And they go, oh, look at that, chicken bones, feathers. I've just pulled these out, cut them out of you. That's proof that the witch has done. But with this, of course, there is physical proof. It's not cheat. You cut that, you find that. And so a Native American tradition seems to have been adopted by Europeans to lead to this new European hybrid of evidence and proof of witchcraft. Just showing the ways in which these things are complex, the ways in which cultural negotiations and understandings take place through witchcraft beliefs. Finally, into the 20th century, and again, most people most historians would dismiss the idea that studying witchcraft, traditional witchcraft, and I don't mean Wicca and neo-pagan witchcraft, which is a whole other story, but traditional witchcraft, the witchcraft that led you to be prosecuted and executed in the past. Most historians, well, practically every historian, would probably think this is really not a subject for 20th century European or British history, but oh yes it is, if you go looking. It's still there. Witchcraft is still relevant in the 20th century for some people, as it was in the 16th century. And to give you an example, in 1916, at the height of the First World War, and the First World War was meant to have changed and transformed the country. 1916, one Somerset farmer had other preoccupations because his cattle were falling ill. And what did that Somerset farmer do? Well, he believed his neighbour had done it. His neighbour was a witch. What did he do? He took his gun and shot him dead. And this was his explanation in court. I have a lot of worry here. He has bewitched my child and my pony. You don't believe in witchcraft, and this is the light bit I like, and the government doesn't, but I do. A fascinating take on how this Somerset farmer in 1916 viewed his whole world conception in confrontation with the state. The government won't do anything about it. You will think you're superior, but no, I know what's right. I know there's witchcraft. I know what did that to my cattle. I'm going to do something about it because the government won't, the state won't. And it's a very interesting ways in which that's conceptualized in 1916 as a kind of confrontation with the state. That's the only witch shooting in this country in the 18th and 19th, 20th centuries. Go to America, and this is where guns come into play, because of course guns were pervasive in 19th and 20th century America, and therefore the gun becomes a much more important item in dealing with witches. One, you just physically go and shoot them dead. That's one way of dealing with it, and there are numerous shootings. Or two, you get the generation of, again, another very strong tradition in America, which is about shooting silver dimes at images of witches. So you would put up an image or an effigy on a tree, you would load your gun with a silver dime, and you would shoot the image, and sympathetically that would harm or kill the witch at a distance. So you either physically go and shoot them, or you do it kind of virtually by use of a silver bullet or a silver dime. Into the post-war period, interwar period and post-war period in the 20th century, witchcraft was still a concern of the authorities in parts of Europe. During the Civil War in Spain, the disruption, the uncertainty, the insecurity is thought to have led to an increase of witchcraft accusations in the 1930s. After the war, Second World War, and the disruption, there was real concerns in Germany in the 1950s about the continued belief in witchcraft and magic. In particular, the role of cunning folk and magicians who were preying on people by saying they were bewitched and then charging for their services. We get the creation of the German Society for Protection Against Superstition in the 1950s, explicitly trying to deal with magical literature, with cunning folk. They're not believing in witches, but they're concerned about the impact and effect of this. And one historian, again, has suggested that the disruption caused by the Second World War and the displacement of people across from, obviously, from Poland and Czechoslovakia, and the movement of Germans who, after the war, this also led to an increase of accusations of witchcraft against women in the 1950s. So this is still significant. An archive for witchcraft superstition is also set up in Germany in the 1950s to try and educate the public about the foolishness of believing in witchcraft and accusing people of witchcraft. In 1950s Yugoslavia, the communist authorities had a big campaign against witchcraft and magic beliefs, had a travelling exhibition that went around trying to educate people again in the foolishness of making accusations or trying to do something supposedly about witches and witchcraft. And that guy there is Johann Cruz, who was one of the leading campaigners in first half of the 20th century against Germany, particularly in northern Germany. He also travelled to America, and this is on his trips to America, when he was giving lectures about the problems of people and belief in witchcraft and magic. That's Kurt Koch, again, very active in southern Germany, a Protestant pastor, who again talked of the waves of superstition washing against the Alps and set about campaigns, writing a series of books about the problems and the continued pervasive belief of witchcraft in southern Germany at this time. That's right into the 60s and 70s. And who's being shot? Who's being accused? When I'm talking about America and the shootings, there are plenty of shootings in France as well, because of the gun culture again, liberalisation of gun culture in France. Here's one. She wasn't murdered, but that's what a witch looks like in 1937 in America. Mrs. Irene Ray accused of witchcraft by her community. An interesting story, because she and her family were drifters. He was unemployed. This was the height of the Great Depression in America. 1932, they moved to Rochester in Illinois, in Indiana, and they get a quite large kind of council house off the state to live in. Now, this is very familiar for today in the whole UKIP thing and immigrants. Why should this family have this large house? They're not part of our community. They're not taxpayers. She is thought to have piercing eyes, long nose, slightly pointed chin, she kind of matches, and that's what people said, well, she looks like a witch. And she profited a bit from it. She knew she had a reputation, so she would make various mumbling and gestures, and she would try and create a bit of fear out of it. So she kind of, she knew there was some benefit in having a witchy reputation. But of course, at some point, the accusations and clamour about what she's been doing and bewitching people come too great. And this is in 1937, the local sheriff actually arrests her because people have brought formal complaints of witchcraft against her. Now, he arrests her for vagrancy, but his intent was to take her out of the community and to try and calm the situation down. But there's poor old Irene, who's done nothing wrong, who ends up in jail because of the community. And who's doing the accusations? This isn't an elderly rump. We're not talking about elderly people in their 80s and 90s, some cling over from some 19th century sort of way of thinking. Here's a witch killer. There we are. It looks rather like James Dean, very smart. This is in the 1930s. And this is Albert Shinsky, who shot dead Susan Mummy because he believed that she was a witch who tormented him in the form of a cat that would sit on his chest every night. Again, probably sleep paralysis. Couldn't take it anymore. Got his gun. She was a widow. She was 59, lived by herself. Again, the stereotype there. And he had seen Mummy in his hallucinations at night transform into this cat that sat on his chest. And so he took his gun and he shot her dead. And as he said to the court and to the police, he said, I would rather face the electric chair than having to go through this anymore. And then when he had killed her, he said, I feel like a new man. The spell had been broken. So that's the face of a witch killer, dapper young man. So we're not talking about elderly people. We need to get our preconceptions of who might be believing in witchcraft in the 20th century. I'll just wrap up now by just thinking about where we are today in terms of traditional witchcraft. Again, I'm not talking about neo-pagan witchcraft and witchcraft as a modern religion. And yeah, okay, I mean, these murders, these accusations, I mean, Shinsky, I should note, ended up spending 45 years in a mental health institution and only got out in the early 1980s. So, he consistently tried to appeal, and you have these interesting transcripts of the psychiatrist interviewing him in the 1970s, whereby he says, I'm sorry for what I did. And they would ask him, do you still believe in witches? Because it was, surely only an insane person would believe in witches, and surely only an insane person would shoot someone. And he was perfectly rational, perfectly sane, knew what he had done, he knew he'd committed a crime. And ultimately, all these probing questions, he still wouldn't reject his belief in witchcraft, ultimately. He said he was sorry for it. He said he was sorry he'd shut Susan up. So, very complex. So that's right in the 1980s. So where are we today? Okay, the shootings stop in France in the 1980s. The shootings stop in America, although there's been a couple of cases fairly recently amongst an Ethiopian community where there was a murder a few years ago. But otherwise, they've largely stopped. Does that mean we're finally rational, finally more rational, finally stopped believing in witchcraft? Well, I don't think so. And obviously, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people around the globe today still believe in witchcraft. People are still dying in other parts of the world. And I don't think we're any better here just because we're no longer murdering and killing. We're any more along the sort of curve of supposed linear progress of belief and rationality. I think it's just that we don't need, again, it comes back to the point, I don't think we need witches anymore. At the present, we don't need them to explain things. We don't need them to do things about misfortune. That doesn't mean we won't have to in the past. In other words, as far as I'm concerned, these sorts of activities, the idea of believing in witches, explanations for misfortune, doing something about it, I think they can quite easily come back because I don't think we've grown out of it. We just don't need them in the present phase of where we are as a society and a community in the 21st century. Thank you.